Peter Kai, welcome back. If you're new here, this channel is where we take fast-moving events and turn them into clear, story-driven narration. If that's what you're into, subscribe to Peter Kai and turn on notifications. Because in this war, the situation can change between one sunrise and the next. And when we're done, I want your take in the comments. I read them and I use them to shape future narrations. Now let's get into it. Russia spent years building military infrastructure meant to be hard to break. Not just trenches and armor, but the deeper architecture behind them. Drone launch sites, storage depots, repair plants, airfields, air defenses, command posts, fuel and lubricant hubs, electronic warfare stations, and the small but crucial facilities that keep long-range attacks running like a conveyor belt. But according to a cluster of Ukrainian and international reports, Ukraine just delivered a three-part strike sequence that went after that system directly. What some described as a three-punch combo, carried out between March 6th and March 8th. And what made it especially striking wasn't only the damage. It was the mix of tools. Ukrainian forces reportedly combined American ATACMS missiles, British Storm Shadow missiles, also known as Scalp in the French variant, and their own expanding long-range arsenal, including a newer domestically developed ballistic missile that's been described as Pelican. This wasn't a random exchange of fire. It was a philosophy. Instead of spending every night trying to swat down incoming drones one by one, Ukraine aimed at the places where drones are stored, prepared, and launched. In other words, don't just shoot the arrows, shoot the archer. And if that sounds like a slogan, listen to the math behind it. Russia has been leaning heavily on Shahed-style one-way attack drones, called Giran in Russian service, to keep constant pressure on Ukrainian cities, infrastructure, and troop positions. One United 24 media report said Russia deployed 5,059 long-range drones against Ukraine in February alone, alongside 288 missiles. That's not a wave. That's a factory schedule. So if you're Ukraine, the question becomes brutal and simple. Do you keep absorbing wave after wave, spending expensive interceptors and exhausting your defenses? Or do you look for the source points, the storage nodes, the launch corridors, and the air defense umbrellas that protect them, and hit those instead? That's what this three-strike sequence was designed to do. And it's important to understand the target category here. Ukraine wasn't only going after the drones themselves, it was going after the ecosystem that makes a drone campaign possible. Where the drones are delivered, where they're assembled or serviced, where they're fueled and configured, where operators and control systems are positioned, where routes are protected by air defenses. If you collapse that ecosystem, you don't just destroy hardware, you force the enemy to rebuild routines. And routines are what let long-range pressure feel automatic. Strike 1 begins in occupied Donetsk. Donetsk has been a central objective for Moscow since the earliest days of the invasion, not only for strategic geography, but for resources and industrial value tied to the region. And according to reporting cited in multiple outlets, on the night leading into March 7th, a heavy strike hit sites near Donetsk airport that Ukraine says were used for the storage, preparation, and launch of Shahed-type strike drones. The method, according to statements attributed to Ukraine's general staff in multiple reports, was a coordinated attack using ATACMS and Storm Shadow or Scalp missiles. Here's why that matters. These missiles aren't built for symbolic damage. They're built to punch through air defenses, hit hardened points, and collapse infrastructure in a way that is not easily repaired. If a long-range drone launch site loses buildings, maintenance capacity, stored equipment, and trained staff working out of those locations, it doesn't just lose a facility, it loses tempo. And tempo is everything in long-range warfare because the goal of drone attacks isn't only destruction, it's fatigue. It's forcing a country to live in constant readiness. It's draining energy systems, air defense stocks, emergency services, and the psychology of ordinary life. So when Ukraine hits a launch site close to the territory Russia wants to pressure, the outcome isn't simply less drones. It's longer flight distances for future drones, more time in the air, more opportunities for detection, and more chances for interception before impact. And there's another layer people forget. Even when a defending side successfully intercepts drones, danger doesn't disappear. Debris still falls. Fragments can still injure civilians. And in high-volume drone warfare, the debris problem scales up with the number of projectiles in the sky. That's one reason why Shoot the Archer is not just a military concept. It's a civilian safety concept too. Now, how did Russia publicly respond? In this narrative, it's the familiar pattern. Deny, distract, and redirect attention to other claims, such as reporting large numbers of Ukrainian drones intercepted in other regions. But the core point remains. When a strike lands on infrastructure that enables Shahed-style operations, it's not easy to pretend the system is untouched. Because you can replace a drone. Replacing a launch ecosystem is slower. Strike 2 follows quickly, and it hits even closer to the idea of Ukraine's growing independence in long-range warfare. On March 8th, the second wave described in these reports targeted another node in occupied Donetsk. The Tokmash factory area, hit by a domestically developed ballistic missile described as the FP-9 Pelikan. This matters for two reasons. First, the payload. Some claims say the Pelikan can carry a warhead of up to roughly 850 kilograms, far heavier than typical long-range drones, which often carry a fraction of that. If accurate, that kind of payload changes the nature of destruction. It's not a fire in a corner of a building, it's structural collapse. Second, the decision chain. When Ukraine uses Western-supplied missiles, the political constraints and permissions around target selection can be complex. But a domestically produced missile shifts the balance. Ukraine can plan, adapt, and strike on its own timeline. That means speed. And speed in this type of war is not a luxury. It's the difference between hitting a warehouse while it's full or arriving after it's been emptied. It's the difference between catching an air defense system in position or missing it after it relocates. It's the difference between breaking a routine or letting the routine continue. And this second strike wasn't described as a single hit. It was described as a follow-up. A second blow that produced secondary explosions, often the sign of stored materials, ammunition, fuel, or equipment cooking off after the initial impact. In modern war, secondary explosions are basically a confession. They tell you something was stored there. They tell you the site mattered, and they tell you the strike found value. The emerging picture is not just Ukraine can strike. It's Ukraine can strike twice. And that changes how any defender has to think. Because one strike is an incident. Two strikes in sequence begins to look like a method. Now we move to strike 3. Crimea. Crimea is not just territory in this war. It's a launch platform. It is tied to airfields, ports, logistics routes, and long-range drone operations that allow Russia to threaten Ukraine from different angles. And according to the report summarized in the script, Ukraine targeted multiple Crimea-related nodes around the same period. One part of that effort described strikes near a naval-related site, damaging or destroying a patrol boat. Another cut against the Black Sea Fleet's already strained posture. But the more strategic part focused on the Kurovsky airfield. In this telling, the target was tied to Russia's Orion heavy strike drones, and the strike reportedly hit the launch ecosystem, control stations, and the site infrastructure that enables these drones to operate. When you remove control stations, you don't just reduce capability, you sever command. And without command, even a powerful drone becomes an expensive object on the ground. Around the same time, the Kyiv Independent reported that Ukrainian long-range drones struck the production workshops of the Yevpatoria aircraft repair plant and hit 2 Panzer S-2 air defense systems near a Russian military airfield in Jankoy. That detail is not random. It points to a repeating tactic. First, weaken the air defense cover. Then, exploit the corridor. Then, strike the high-value node. That sequence, air defense, corridor, strike, shows up again and again in modern operations, because the most valuable targets are rarely undefended. They sit under radar, under missiles, under layered systems meant to make a strike too expensive to attempt. So Ukraine flips the logic. It spends effort to open a path, and then it uses that path to hit a node that causes lasting disruption. And that is why these three strikes, Donetsk, Donetsk again, and Crimea, are being framed as a connected operation rather than isolated explosions. It's a pattern of dismantling, not only destroying drones, destroying what makes drones practical. Now, there's a final detail in your script that matters because it hints at how these operations are evolving. It wasn't just Western missiles fired in isolation. It was a more complex, combined approach, closer to the logic Russia has used for years. Saturate defenses with multiple threats so the real strike package slips through. In practical terms, this can mean sending drones on routes that force air defenses to light up, reposition, and burn ammunition. It can mean pushing defenders to make fast decisions under uncertainty. And once defenders are fixated on the wrong layer, once their attention, radar coverage, and interceptors are pulled away, the heavier weapons arrive where the system is weakest. That's not just about damage. That's about forcing mistakes. And in a war where air defense is always under strain, mistakes become openings. Now, I want to pause and put the scale of the drone war into perspective, because without that scale, these strikes can sound like just another headline. A Business Insider report described President Volodymyr Zelensky saying, Russia has fired more than 57,000 Shahed-style drones since the full-scale invasion began. Think about what 57,000 means. It means nights interrupted. It means infrastructure repaired and hit again. It means air defense teams forced to perform perfectly, endlessly. It means the same streets, the same neighborhoods, the same power lines living under repetition. And it means the battlefield isn't only a line on the map, it's the sky. So when Ukraine chooses to attack launch sites and supporting facilities, it is trying to reduce the number of nights that look like that. Not by catching every incoming object, but by shrinking the stream upstream. Now here's the part that may be the most important long-term signal. Ukraine is pairing two worlds at once. On one side, Western missiles, Storm Shadow and ATACMS, used to break open critical targets in a way that drones often can't. On the other side, Ukraine's own growing long-range industry, ballistic missiles and strike drones that are produced domestically and can be deployed without waiting for anyone else's permission. If that combination continues to mature, it changes the negotiation dynamic of the war. Because the question stops being, will Ukraine be allowed to strike? And becomes, how often can Ukraine strike? That's where Kyiv's argument to allies comes in. Ukrainian officials and commentators have repeatedly suggested that more Western missiles and fewer restrictions on how they're used would allow Ukraine to conduct more of these complex, layered operations. Operations that overwhelm defenses, confuse radar networks, and hit multiple points in a single time window. And this is where the story becomes both military and political. Because from the Ukrainian perspective, the limitation is not ideas. The limitation is volume. A limited number of missiles means each strike has to be chosen like a surgical decision. A larger supply changes the approach. It turns rare strikes into routine pressure. And routine pressure is what breaks infrastructure over time. But the West, as the argument goes, hesitates. Concerns about escalation, fears about unpredictable responses, and the desire to avoid direct confrontation have all shaped the pace and the quantity of what is delivered. So Ukraine adapts again. It invests millions into a domestic missile industry. It experiments, it iterates, it builds. And if claims about systems like Pelican are even partially accurate, range estimates around 800 kilometers, high terminal speed, heavy payload, then Ukraine's long-range capability is not just surviving, it's evolving. And what makes this even more dangerous for Russia is that it's not only about one missile type, it's about a production culture. Once a country proves it can design, test, and field a heavier weapon, then improve it, then scale it, every next iteration becomes faster. The first version is the hardest. After that, the question becomes how many you can build, how quickly you can find targets, and how effectively you can open corridors through air defenses. And on the topic of corridors, this is where support infrastructure becomes the hidden battleground. Fuel depots, lubricant storage, electronic warfare stations, command posts. They don't sound as dramatic as airfields, but they are the nerves and veins of a strike campaign. If a drone launch site loses fuel, it can't launch. If it loses electronic warfare cover, it becomes easier to detect. If it loses a command post, it loses coordination. If it loses a repair facility, it loses endurance. And that's why, even outside the March 6th to March 8th window, reports have described strikes on things like fuel and lubricant depots and electronic warfare nodes in the same general theater. The war is becoming a contest of systems, not just soldiers, systems. Now, a Forbes report described Ukraine's long-range strike campaign as expanding deeper into Russia, with new missiles and drones becoming cheaper and easier to produce, and cited examples of strikes reaching well over 1,000 kilometers inside Russia. This is the nightmare for any large state relying on strategic depth, because strategic depth used to mean you could move factories and depots farther from the front. But if the enemy's strike radius expands, depth becomes less like safety and more like a larger map full of targets. And that forces a choice. Either you spread air defenses across a vast territory, thinning them everywhere, or you concentrate defenses around a few high-value areas, leaving the rest exposed. In either case, it's a stress test. Now, the reason this March 6th to March 8th sequence is being discussed so intensely is because it compresses multiple lessons into a short time frame. Lesson 1. Complex attacks work. If you combine drones to distract and saturate and missiles to deliver the knockout blow, defenders face too many problems at once. Lesson 2. Air defenses are a finite resource. If systems like Panzer are destroyed, forced to relocate or stretch thin, then the corridor opens wider. Lesson 3. Domestic production changes the political equation. A domestically produced missile is not only a weapon, it's strategic freedom. Lesson 4. The target selection is shifting. Not only frontline forces, but the infrastructure that makes long-range pressure possible. Launch sites, repair plants, control stations, storage nodes, the skeleton of the drone war. And Lesson 5 is the one most people underestimate. When you start hitting occupied territory nodes, Donetsk, Crimea, you're not only damaging hardware, you're changing the geometry of the war. If Russia loses launch sites closer to Ukraine, the remaining sites are farther away. And if remaining sites are farther away, pressure on Ukraine doesn't end, but efficiency drops. And efficiency is what makes terror campaigns sustainable. So what happens next? If this pattern continues, Ukraine's long-range strikes may become more frequent, more layered, and more disruptive. If Western allies increase missile deliveries and loosen restrictions, Ukraine argues it can break more records. If Western support stays limited, Ukraine signals it will compensate by scaling domestic systems like Pelican and other long-range designs, turning what began as improvisation into an industry. Either way, the implication is the same. The infrastructure Russia spent years building is no longer untouchable. And if a launch ecosystem goes up in smoke, it's not something you rebuild in a weekend. It's logistics. It's people. It's spare parts. It's procedures. It's security. It's the entire machine. Now I want to hand it to you with 2 questions, and I want real answers in the comments. Question 1. Do you think striking launch sites and control stations is more effective than trying to intercept drones in the air, even if it risks escalation? Question 2. If Ukraine's domestic ballistic missiles keep improving, do you think Western restrictions will matter less over time, or will missile supply still be the decisive factor? Drop your thoughts below. I read them, and the best points often shape the next narration. If this narration helped you understand what happened and why it matters, subscribe to Peter Kai. It tells the platform that deep narration-first analysis is worth sharing. And if you made it all the way through, type one word in your comment. Corridor. This is Peter Kai, and I'll be back soon.